So thus far we've discussed the various cells that make up nervous tissue in the central and peripheral nervous systems, but how do they function to control the human body? Well, when it comes to classifying neurons based on their function, we can separate them into three categories: sensory neurons, integration neurons or interneurons, and motor neurons. So sensory or afferent neurons are going to send an action potential toward the central nervous system, away from the sensor. Okay, so if you think afferent, think of away from the initial stimulus. And so that would be kind of like if you saw the glass of water and you were thirsty, it'd start to send that sensation to the integration center, to the interneuron, which is going to send an action potential from the neuron to another neuron. So it receives input from one neuron, the sensory neuron, and sends or propagates that signal onward to a different neuron, which carries out the effect. The effect. It ends up effecting something. The effect caused the change, and the effect carries out the command. So the motor neuron is going to carry the action potential away from the central nervous system toward the effector. Okay, so get that straight. Practice your afferent, efferent pathways, because this is important when we're talking about the nervous system and afferent versus efferent neurons. And we'll keep reiterating that throughout this lecture as well. So sensory or afferent neurons, we can think of afferent as A for all aboard, away from the sensor. So all aboard, onward, go toward the interneuron. This is going to be in the dorsal root of the spinal cord. So if you look back here, we're going from the sensation into the spinal cord and then up to the brain and then out to the motor input or output. The nerve endings that detect temperature, pain, touch, all these different sensations, those are the sensory receptors. Okay, so that can be something that we find in our skin, such as a thermoregulator, or a thermoreceptor, I should say, that would send a signal through the dorsal root, the posterior root of the spinal cord, and make contact with an interneuron, which would send straight to the brain and then come back down from the brain, whatever signal the brain says to do, and make contact with an interneuron, and then carry out the motor effect. So the sensory neuron can be found in the skin. It could also be found on the edges of glands or in the stomach. It's just wherever we have sensory input coming in. So in your eyes, sensations in your nose, anywhere you have sensory input. So again, this sends the information to the interneurons, the green. So the blue is the sensory neuron coming in. I guess here it shows green, but blue initially, sensory receptor. And then it's a green pathway, but that's basically going to make contact with this interneuron, which I have in green here for the next couple slides. And you'll notice here that it can go from the sensory neuron to the brain. Goodness gracious. Sensory neuron to the brain, or it can go sensory neuron straight to an interneuron and bypass the entire brain connection and make a reflex. This is the context of a reflex arc. It's an unconscious reaction. And we'll talk about that when we get to the neural reflex arc. Now, interneurons are the association neurons, meaning they create meaning from whatever is input into the system and then distribute a command to the motor activity. There's going to be interneurons in the brain as well as in the spinal cord, which contribute again to that neural reflex arc that we'll discuss here shortly. So I have everything color-coded. The blue would make contact with the green, and then green would make contact with the red. This will make more sense when I have the other diagram on again. So efferent would be the motor neuron, efferent for exiting the spinal cord and going through the ventral root of the spinal cord. So this would be dorsal with the sensory, ventral with the motor, receives input from the interneuron, carries out the effect to the effector organ, which in this scenario is the skeletal muscle. It could also be cardiac muscle or glands even. And so this is where it makes sense with my colors. Your reflex is going to be an automatic or unconscious response to a stimulus produced by the reflex arc. So you have your sensory receptor, which is blue. In this scenario, it would be somewhere in the eye. and then your sensory neuron would receive input from that, and it would send to two different areas, one to the brain, but that takes a long time, and one is through the spinal cord. So it doesn't go all the way up the spinal cord, it just goes into the spinal cord and then immediately back out, so that we can have a rapid response, a reflex. So the blue makes contact with the green interneuron, and then it makes contact with the red motor neuron to carry out the effect. Skips the entire decision-making process of this aspect of the interneuron. Instead, we're skipping that, and we're going from sensory neuron into spinal cord, and then straight back out into a motor neuron. This can be seen very obviously when you're talking about something that was hot, maybe. So you touch something that was scalding hot, your immediate reaction isn't, oh, I should take my hand off. It's, your hand just comes off. You don't even think about it. And that's because it doesn't actually make a message to the brain. The sensation goes through the sensory neuron into the spinal cord, and immediately it makes contact with an interneuron, or a relay neuron as they have it laid, makes a relay out to the motor neuron, and immediately hits a skeletal muscle so that you rip your arm away, so that you're not burning your hand while you're thinking about whether or not you should pull your hand away. And then the message still makes its way to the brain, and you're like, wow, that really hurt. And so that message made it there, it just wasn't as quick as your immediate reaction to whip your hand away. And that is what's characteristic of a reflex arc. You have a sensory neuron, an interneuron, and a motor neuron. And no brain was utilized in that, only the spinal cord aspect of the central nervous system. So that reflex arc incorporated the peripheral nervous system with the sensory receptors and motor neurons, but it also utilized the spinal cord of the central nervous system, and it used that to relay as an interneuron between the sensation and the motor output. The systems work in concert to maintain homeostasis. So we've covered how the brain and the spinal cord work together with the peripheral nerves and the sensation, but we can classify the peripheral nervous system even further based on how they regulate the body. We can break the peripheral nervous system into autonomic and somatic nervous systems. The somatic nervous system is associated with voluntary responses. It's responsible for our conscious perception of the environment and our voluntary responses to that perception by means of skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system controls cardiac and smooth muscle, as well as glandular tissue. It's associated with involuntary responses, such as those related to homeostasis. This autonomic nervous system can be further divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system is associated with your fight or flight response, while parasympathetic is referred to by the epithet of rest and digest. So even though we can break up the categories for peripheral and central nervous system, we can break these up into two, they still work in concert to provide homeostasis. And we'll see this further when we discuss this reflex arc. And so, starting off with the somatic nervous system, we have a sensory perception, a central processing, and then a motor response. And so, with that reflex arc that we started discussing, the sensory input, such as a painful stimulus, is the afferent sensory neuron. Okay, so your afferent nerves. This is that unipolar neuron that we talked about. They're only sensory neurons. So that sensory receptor in the skin sent a signal to the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron relayed that into the spinal cord here, made synaptic connections with the interneuron, which made its synaptic connections with the efferent nerve, and the efferent nerve made contact with the effector muscle to change a behavior. Okay? So again, I have them color-coded, so hopefully this is starting to work out for you. The blue would be sensory, the green would be the central or the interneural processing, and then the red would be the motor response. And processing can not just be the brain, but can be the spinal cord in a reaction that is immediate and unconscious. So central processing here was the synapse in the spinal cord with the interneuron. Doesn't really show it too well here, but you can see spinal cord. There's definitely an interneuron in there that's making contact between the sensory nerve and the motor neuron.